5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey space friends, I was thrilled to sit down this week with Delian Asparouhov, who's a principal at Founders Fund, the famed venture capital fund, and also a co-founder and president of Varda, a space startup that's focused on in-space manufacturing. So we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. If you enjoy the podcast, just a reminder, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform so other people can find it. Thank you very much. And as always, here are a couple of short messages from our sponsors, and then please enjoy my conversation with Delian.
My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by Nano Avionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
Well, welcome back, everybody. This week I'm here with Delian Asparouhov. Hey, welcome, Delian, to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on, Raphael. Very excited.
It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to that. I mean, obviously we have overlapping roles. To some of our roles are overlapping. We're both involved in venture capital investing and looking at the space sector. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for a start?
Yeah, so my brief background, I'm currently principal at Founders Fund, which is one of the sort of preeminent venture firms, based in both Silicon Valley and Miami. I myself am based in Miami. We have a total of, on the order of sort of 20 billion in AUM and 3 billion in sort of recent funds, and invest anywhere from, sort of leading seed rounds with a, $750K check all the way to leading Series F rounds with $200 million checks across a wide variety of industries, from everything from, we're one of the biggest checks in Airbnb, but we were also one of the biggest checks in SpaceX, since aerospace is a sort of significant, focus area, but we also do a very broad set of investing. And then I actually split my time between investing at Founders Fund with a company that I actually incubated. Founders Fund is famous for doing several relatively large incubations, Palantir being our very first one. And more recently, Anduril, which has done quite well in the United States. And then we've actually done 2 incubations in the past sort of year, Varda, which I incubated, and OpenStore, which one of my partners incubated. And so I split my time with, Varda, where I'm the sort of president and chairman of the company. And there we're basically building the world's first space factories. And so we take raw materials up to space, fabricate them in a way that is just not possible on Earth, and then bring those materials back down to our customers down here on Earth. So I always say we're making space factories that are for Earth, not space factories for space. So yeah, that's me.
Well, fantastic. There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, we could just spend hours just talking about Founders Fund. It's probably fair to say that Founders Fund must have one of the biggest stables of unicorns, so to say, on Earth. But we can't do this any justice, and it's a space podcast. So I suggest we let's focus on 2 topics here. Let's talk a little bit about space in general and your thoughts on space in general and the opportunity that I think we both probably agree that exists there over the next years and maybe even decades. And then after that, we can delve a little bit more into Varda, because it's just such an interesting company. But why don't we start with space in general? And first question, I mean, how did you actually get involved in sort of like space investments? Is it as simple as saying that, well, as you said, Founders Fund, obviously very close to SpaceX, one of the biggest investors, I think one of your former partners, Luke, is still on the board of SpaceX. Is it as simple as that, or is there more of a story?
Yeah, I had been a space enthusiast for, quite some time, ever since, I was a kid, and, sort of grew up in high school in the United States, sort of around, to sort of 2008, 2011, which is sort of the, early, SpaceX years, as they were just sort of getting Falcon 1 off the ground, and the company was starting to, launch on a more and more regular basis. And so that was honestly, the original inspiration was the combination of sort of like, sci-fi books and seeing SpaceX. But I didn't really know how I wanted to approach, the industry. I had a couple of friends. I ended up studying computer science at MIT, and I had a couple of friends that after MIT ended up deciding to go work at SpaceX directly. And that was how they decided to get involved in the industry. But it just wasn't a path that excited me. I found myself to be a pretty decent, software engineer. But what I really liked was the combination of engineering, business, product, sales, et cetera, being much more, sort of multidisciplinary. And so I actually ended up leaving MIT, dropping out to start my first company, which is sort of like a boring enterprise healthcare company. But I always consistently told my friends, I was like, the only point of me going to Silicon Valley and starting to understand how to build startups is because like one day I want to do a space company. But I sort of had only seen one mold of successful space entrepreneur, which was sort of the like, Jurvetson, Chamath, Elon, Branson sort of approach, which is basically like get rich off of normal things and then like go do space stuff. So I was like, okay, I got to go like do normal things. Like I'll pay attention to the space stuff, but let's like do the normal things. And then around the sort of like 2016, 17 timeframe, I had this like sudden aha moment where I was like, oh, the barriers to entry and the cost of doing space have dropped enough that you no longer actually have to be a billionaire to necessarily start a successful, space company or to invest in space companies. And so I somewhat, fortuitously through a couple of random circumstances ended up landing at Coastal Ventures in the summer of 2017. And Coastal Ventures is actually one of the primary backers of Rocket Lab and of Skybox back in the day, which sold to Google and eventually became Planet. And so, they were also, like Founders Fund, a sort of very preeminent space investor. And so when I started there, I decided, okay, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm now here and have this platform that is known for space investing. I'm going to try to build that up as a personal skill set. And so I started going to space conferences, meeting with space CEOs, and about 7 months in, actually made sort of, convinced the firm, to make an investment into my first, sort of space company. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm going to start taking this really seriously. Like now that I actually like saw the fruits of my labor of like, being a hobby for years and years, then eventually being a nights and weekends professional project. And now it's actually my job. Now I'm going to just like lean as hard into this as much as I can. And so really started to spend, 25, 30, 40% of my time sort of on space. And that's what eventually led me over to Founders Fund. And eventually, that sort of expertise is what led me to, eventually incubating Varda.
What was that first investment, by the way?
So the first investment actually was this company, Akash Systems. It sort of fits
like
into
advanced chipsets for SATCOM, right?
For SATCOM. Exactly. So they're GaN on diamond sort of satellite radios. And so they now finally, after, a lot of R&D, have produced the world's most efficient, lowest power, highest bandwidth radio that's ever been, produced for use in satellite communications, which can be a huge advantage to whichever satellites integrate with it. It sort of fits into my sort of original, and first sort of space thesis, which was that there is clearly a space boom happening, right? The combination of, lowered long costs, exponential rise in the amount of, venture investors and dollars flowing into the ecosystem, and the exponential rise in the number of satellites going up, that there was this massive gold rush. And the best place to be in a gold rush isn't necessarily to be the one scooping for the gold, but being the people selling the picks and shovels. So I've had this very picks and shovels based approach to, my space investing, where the first one in that thesis was Akash Systems. The idea being, okay, everybody needs satellite radios. Well, if you invest in the company that makes the best satellite radios, they'll be in a very great spot in the value chain to capture a decent amount of value. And then probably the second and third investments that I made in that category was MagDrive, which is based in the UK. They're a small sat, propulsion startup where most of the people working on small sat propulsion. So for those that aren't maybe familiar with space, once a satellite goes up into space, it does need to be able to sort of like move itself around.
Yes.
Right now, there's sort of two options on two ends of the curve. There's chemical propulsion, which moves you quickly but is very inefficient, and then there's electric propulsion, which is very efficient but moves you really, really slowly. Both of them have downsides. Most startups that I'd seen sort of working in small satellite propulsion were sort of marginal improvements on either end of the spectrum. MagDrive was the first one that felt like it was actually sort of a 10x improvement, i.e. they provide both very fast movement, high thrust, and very efficient, i.e. high impulse. And so that was sort of my second investment in the sort of like picks and shovels thesis. And then the third is this company called Hadrian based in Los Angeles. That thesis is around most of the aerospace companies in the United States and abroad rely on a network of sort of mom and pop machine shops that were largely set up around World War II that effectively deliver most of the actual metal parts that you need to actually build a rocket, satellite, et cetera. These things are very non-tech forward. However, they have extremely specialized hardware and skill sets to build the very precise materials that you need for space. And so Hadrian is trying to disrupt that by sort of creating a full stack equivalent of these sort of mom and pop machine shops where they both have software that allows you to track your order and see when it's going to arrive, all the way down to they actually run the CNC machines and try to automate the paths and the actual tooling to produce the parts that you need. And so again, similarly, Akash provides the radios, MagDrive provides the propulsion. Hadrian provides the actual structures and what you need to actually build the satellite. And so I've steadily tackled each individual component. At some point, I would like to do sort of flight computers that are rad hardened, and at some point maybe a battery investment, a solar panel investment. So there's more to come with this thesis in terms of investment.
You're trying to be across the stack and sort of get broad exposure to space economy and all of the key things that people need. That's very smart, and kind of I hope we're kind of operating in a similar way. Coming back, so taking a step back to on the macro side, you started mentioning core parts of the thesis already, which is basically like lowering of barriers, which has to do with like substantially, I think, with the lowering of the costs of accessing space, so like the launch costs, just like originally Falcon 9 bringing it down, some other people just having more options, like you mentioned Rocket Lab, and now we've had actually we have a few people who have now reached orbit on the private side, right? Like most Firefly tried most recently, didn't make it the first time, probably make it hopefully next time. Obviously Virgin Orbit is there now, and Astra and other people. So this group is expanding. So and this is just one of basically the examples of cost and access becoming easier. Probably what some people on average less know that, but you and I are very familiar that also the cost of the components is dropping across the curve, sort of like Moore's law and sometimes faster curves. So I think those are kind of the by now almost, at least to people like us, obvious parts of the thesis. I'm curious, do you think there's any sort of like non-obvious parts of the thesis? Why space should be really attractive over the next, decades?
Yeah, I think the thing that, people pay sometimes almost too much attention to the actual like inputs of a space business, all the costs that go into it, the combination of all these like components that you're mentioning. But I think the thing that people haven't necessarily paid enough attention to and should be more on their radar is the output. A lot of space companies just sell to other space companies.
Yes.
And that can be fine while you're propped up by venture capital, et cetera. But at some point, this ecosystem needs to provide value to external providers, right? It's just like, you can't just have a software company only selling to other software companies. It eventually has to sell to like the Walmarts, et cetera, of the world. Otherwise, you get the dot-com boom where everybody's just selling to each other. And then the moment that the venture capital song stops, all of a sudden the entire ecosystem collapses. Yes. You're not actually providing value to like the outside world. And so I think that's one of the things that isn't paid enough attention to in space. People talk about a space bubble, but again, they analyze it from the inputs. There's a lot of dollars going into the ecosystem, et cetera. But that's not the interesting metric to be tracking in order to determine whether or not there's a bubble. The most interesting metric to be tracking that I think is relatively non-obvious is how much of all of the space companies' revenues are from companies that have nothing to do with space.
Yes.
And that number only very recently to me is getting quite exciting. For example, one of the companies that I think is, most interesting, right now that is, I forget if they've managed to go public or they're about to, finalize the SPAC, but, Spire, I think has done a really great job of going direct to companies that have nothing to do with space, whether it's, flood insurance, wildfire insurance, hedge funds, et cetera, and providing them space data and space intelligence, but packaged in a way where the companies that they're selling to could care less about Spire being a space.
It could come from somewhere else. It doesn't matter. Yeah,
exactly. It could come from drones. It could come from planes, etc. They could care less. And they're providing it in such a packaged and easy to understand way where their end customers have to know nothing about space. Yeah. And that to me is in some ways the most important metric. And I feel like that metric is only recently starting to shift and still needs to come a long way to match with the inputs into the system, i.e. the venture capital. But that's also part of the thesis behind Varda of we're a space factors company, but at the end of the day, we're a materials company. And our customers could care less about the fact that we're a space materials company. They just care that we have the best materials because that's what they're purchasing. They're not purchasing anything to do with the fact that we go to space.
Yeah, and it's wow, I fully agree with you. It's actually there's a page in our current pitch deck for our current fundraising, which actually is we kind of one way we split the universe of investable companies in quote unquote space, right? And people have different definitions of that, as we both know, right? One part is what you're mentioning is sort of like the space companies, which are what people think about space companies. So like rocket companies, companies that produce satellites, companies produce satellite components. And then the other part, which arguably is becoming increasingly the more important and interesting one, which is the one you're alluding to, which is sort of like, well, companies that take advantage of space technology, but to provide something of value to large existing markets on Earth. And that, honestly, we would like to do much more of that. So, but let me tell you what the problem is we have, and then you can tell me whether you've seen the same thing or what you think about it. What we're seeing, maybe problem is too hard a word, but sort of like the current status of that is we sometimes compare the current situation of space with sort of like the internet was in the mid-90s. And when the internet was in the mid-90s, if you looked at the typical internet, well, there weren't that many, but a typical internet entrepreneur in the mid-90s was like Marc Andreessen, computer science person, right? hence he does an internet company. Right now, if I had to guess, I would say 95%, whatever, the vast majority of business plans I get, if you go to the team page, space engineering, aero-astro engineering, mechanical engineering with a space minor, worked at Airbus. And that's fine, obviously, for the space part. The problem is if they then want to do something where they sell to, insurance companies or agri companies or chemical companies, unfortunately, typically they have no understanding whatsoever of the industry they want to sell in. So that's the problem we're running up against a little bit at the moment and trying to have these business models which serve large existing markets on Earth. I don't know, do you see the same thing? And if yes, what do you think? How can we sort of kind of solve that?
Yeah, I mean, this comes down to, one of the fundamental filters that we have when, we consider investment, which is, does the, core skill sets of the founding team line up with the core risks, and are they world-class in tackling and burning down, those risks? And I agree that it is something that is quite rare in a space company, in that, yes, most are founded by, JPL, NASA, SpaceX, et cetera, space engineers on the founding team. And it's great to have as a part of the founding team, but you don't want it to have it be the entire founding team. And so again, I come back to, Varda, where, yes, one of our co-founders is a space engineer, and he understands that world very well. From SpaceX. Myself, I'm a venture capitalist. I understand the business world very well. And then our third co-founder, our chief scientist, he's a material scientist that primarily focuses on materials that are used entirely on Earth in Earth-based markets, and has very little skill set, if anything, to do with space, right? And so intentionally tried to set up a very diverse sort of founding team in terms of skill set, strength, et cetera, that were directly correlated with what we found the three core risks to be, which was capital-intensive project, i.e. the financing, the space operations and producing the materials up there, and then the third risk, i.e. bringing that value back down to customers, here on Earth. And so I agree, it's very much a, limitation of the space ecosystem today, that there's not enough non-space people founding space companies, because those people would be critical, whether they have a fire or, earthquake insurance background or flooding, background. Those types of people should recognize that their skill sets are actually very valuable in the space ecosystem and would be incredible co-founders. And on the flip side, the space engineers should be going out and searching for those type of co-founders. I made a very intentional, I think one of the things that, I think a lot of also founding teams make a mistake of is they tend to just try to find people that are sort of like themselves and their founding team, right? Yeah. They go out and they're like, oh, well, I was at SpaceX, let me just get a bunch of my SpaceX buddies together and we're going to go co-found a company that's in XYZ industry. And it's okay. Or you could be a co-founder and then you could spend 6 months to a year hunting down world-class people in completely unrelated industries and then forming a team around that. And I think they think, oh, well, how am I going to be a co-founder with, somebody that I've only just met or I've only just interviewed? Well, if you actually, I think most people don't appreciate this. If you run a statistical regression on the companies that have IPO'd in the past decade that have been venture-backed, there's almost no correlation between the amount of time the founders knew each other before starting the business to the outcome of the business. And so we tend to take the approach in our incubations of just handpicking world-class people across the various skill sets that are necessary and forming those. So for example, Keith Raboy, the partner that I work with a lot of Founders Fund, when he co-founded Open Door back in the day, the 4 co-founders literally didn't know each other at all. And yet Open Door today is a, I think $17 billion company, right? And they all met basically on day one of the company. And so I think people don't recognize that this is a very reasonable and appropriate process to go through in terms of finding somebody that has that appropriate, much more diverse skill set than just a space engineer.
Yeah, I think it's just so interesting that I guess the best case in point for this problematic we're talking about here is that you guys had to incubate Varda in-house, right? Apparently you couldn't find a existing team that you were confident enough with. Is that, and I guess we are internally also working on at least sort of 2 potential incubation projects in space, because again, we can't find anybody doing. Is that sort of something similar you're seeing? Do you think Varda may not be the last sort of incubation project in space, or do you think there's other opportunities?
Yeah, I think the way that Varda honestly started was I had this investment thesis around space manufacturing for quite some time around these materials, and I thought that for a variety of reasons it was a sort of very undertapped market, because most people were doing things that I thought were sort of much further out, i.e. space manufacturing for space or asteroid mining or lunar mining, and those things to me are like sci-fi projects that I get that for some reason venture capitalists have backed in the past, but that makes sort of no sense to me whatsoever. Versus space manufacturing for Earth is very near term, commercially pragmatic. And so early in 2020, before COVID, I actually went out and spent a lot of time with all the various researchers, teams who were working on this, and sort of came across this fundamental problem where, unfortunately, all of those sort of like founding teams, executives, et cetera, were just way too narrow in terms of skill set and way too closed-minded in terms of approach to actually bring it to market that just didn't feel commercially viable. And so the project sort of went on the shelf for 6 months. And I sort of had this frustration where I was like, well, what the hell? The economics make sense. The market is ready. Like the technology is there. Why is nobody doing this? And I just kind of realized I was like, I don't want to be asking myself this same question in 5 years. And if there's still nobody doing it, I need to like go do it or else it's not going to happen. Partially because I believe, when we were talking about sort of that metric of, space companies providing value to Earth, that is the best metric to track whether or not we will become a multiplanetary species. Like I love that, Elon builds bigger and bigger and bigger rockets, but that's not the thing fundamentally that is going to make us a multiplanetary species. Yeah. If you look at California, the way that California got developed wasn't by Lewis and Clark arriving on an extremely large boat. The way California became California was the gold rush. It was providing economic value to the rest of the economy. And then that is what caused it to be industrialized and settled and grow very rapidly. And that we need to be focusing on that for space as well, where the gold rush for space is the metric of how is space providing value back to the rest of the Earth economy, and that space manufacturing is one of the best ways to massively grow that particular metric that will eventually lead us to becoming a multiplanetary species.
Yeah, and I mean it's really quite interesting in various ways, right? Because I mean you mentioned sort of the difference between space manufacturing for space, right? There's sort of the people who want to build satellites in orbit, right? And to some extent that has actually happened before the space manufacturing for Earth, right? With companies like Made in Space, but now finally it looks like we have several companies really focusing on space manufacturing for Earth, and of course it makes all the sense in the world because we've known for many years that it makes theoretical sense to produce certain things in space, or we can only do that. It was just always too expensive, but now the costs are coming down, so it's a prime example of using that trend. So in terms of so let's say you produce something in space, and I think how much of a difficulty is then sort of like integrating that into sort of like existing, let's call it supply chains for lack of a better word, on Earth? Do you think that's going to be fairly sort of like smooth, or is that maybe harder than first meets the eye?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the way that we think of the company is we're sort of like a contract manufacturer that provides zero gravity to our clients. At some point, I would love it if it's much closer to a relationship where a manufacturer comes to me and says, "Hey, I have this process that I would like to be done in zero G. Can you please do that for me? Because I know you have the expertise, the logistics, the infrastructure, et cetera." However, it's not that simple today. Instead, we have to go quote unquote much more full stack, where we actually have to sort of become our own customer, right? It's just like the iPhone didn't, launch with the App Store on day one. They developed their first 14 apps. We're sort of having to do the same thing where, for our first handful of materials, we're having to go much deeper. We're actually buying the raw supplies ourselves, producing them in microgravity, integrating them into actual end components, systems, and then finally selling those end systems. And over time, we're trying to convince people, hey, we don't really want to be buying the raw materials, and we don't really want to be the integrator. And eventually we'll hand those off to others and focus on sort of like our core skill sets, and then just start to expand the sets of materials that we work on. But yeah, that's partially why, there's almost like a third of the team at Varda that is sort of like a, material science PhD type team that really focuses on those, sort of more, full stack integrations to make sure that we can more smoothly integrate into the supply chain. And it is definitely, not an easy process. It is not as simple as, hey, let's just apply zero G to this manufacturing and then our customers will pay us. There's a lot more work that's going into it. But I hope that, again, just like the iPhone proved out the value of the platform by developing the first 14 apps, and then 2, 3, 4 versions later, then had a very vibrant app ecosystem. I hope the same thing will happen with us, where we will prove out these first handful of applications, and then that will prove the value of the platform, and then we can really just focus on the platform and have many apps coming to us.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting you're saying that, because I actually another thing I totally agree with. I think actually some people, some potential or existing space entrepreneurs sometimes make that mistake that they don't appreciate that, at least for the moment, I believe, and you seem to believe as well, it's better to err on the side of more integration, more vertical integration, because just developing like one part of the supply chain, at times it just becomes really difficult to convince people that you want to fit in there, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think too many people start off with the approach of like, hey, we're going to be the platform where you can go space manufacture. And it's like, but nobody wants to fucking
nobody's coming. You put the platform, nobody comes.
Exactly. And so that just makes no sense to me. Or it's like, they're trying to again, it's just you need to prove the value first and develop it sort of end to end, and then you can start to extract yourself from it and then start to lay yourself on top. In some ways we're a materials company for the next 5 years, and then eventually we'll be a space manufacturing company. But right now we're mostly a materials company. We got to take the materials from start to finish and make sure that there's value for our end customers, and over time we can start to become more of a platform.
Okay, but let me ask you this, and so delve into some of your other portfolio companies. So let's take MacDrive, for example, because MacDrive is actually sort of an anti-example of that, because MacDrive is actually doing basically one very specific, very sophisticated component, which is the propulsion system. One could argue okay, but if we generally like more, I'm just playing devil's advocate, right? If we generally like more vertical integration, should they not, rather than trying then to convince the various customers to buy their propulsion system rather than various unnamed other, and there's so many, right, propulsion systems, maybe they should kind of do their, own space tug or something, which will be so much better than all other space tugs. But obviously that's, at least as far as I know, is not the current strategy of MacDrive. So how did you guys sort of weigh that, those considerations?
Yeah, I think it's a relatively simple analysis, which is basically, is there a value chain that already exists or is there not, right? In space manufacturing, there is not a value chain that exists today. And so you need to fully integrate across that entire value chain in order to deliver it. And then over time, you can start to commoditize certain segments of the value chain and extract yourselves from them, and instead have external providers that commoditize it. MagDrive operates in a pre-existing value chain that is very vibrant and very established, i.e., satellite manufacturing, right? There are many satellites that go up, there are many that get built, and each of them has very consistent layers of batteries, solar panel, flight computer, structures, propulsion. And so in pre-existing value chains, it's actually quite difficult to fully vertically integrate, because the likelihood of you being able to compete across every single one of those very established, layers of the value chain is actually extremely difficult. And so you're much better off focusing on one segment and then just having a very differentiated product. And so the strategy of a company highly depends on the sort of maturity of the value chain that you're stepping into. And so, in 30 years, maybe there'll be somebody that steps into the space manufacturing value chain and says, hey, I'm just going to focus on this very one particular component of the space manufacturing value chain.
Bioreactor payload. I'm going to, something like that.
Exactly. I'm going to have the best microgravity bioreactor, right? That company will be a very valuable company one day, and it will kind of look like MagDrive in terms of strategy. Yeah, but the appropriate timing for that is definitely not right now, because right now, if you do that, that's just a complete waste of capital.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's do a similar announcement for Hadrian. And I find it a fascinating company. It's probably the one I least know, unfortunately. But so this is basically, if I understand it, it's just aerospace focused manufacturing in a much more efficient way. And like you said, a lot of aerospace manufacturing, for various reasons, cost plus contracts and everything, it's just ludicrously inefficient, right?
And this is, again, in a very established value chain, they're focusing on a very, very narrow segment. This isn't just satellite manufacturing as a whole, where yes, it's cost plus base. Hadrian is focused on aluminum bolts and rivets and fasteners. And it turns out everybody from satellites to rockets to everything in space needs to be joined together. And so they're just focusing on the parts that need to be joined together. And it turns out if you're in space and you have a joiner, and especially if it's on a rocket, it needs to be very tightly manufactured. The precision and the tolerances have to be very, very, very tight. And so what they're saying is, hey, we're going to focus on this very one particular segment, and we're going to do it the best. Because right now, your option is go to a mom and pop shop. You have to deliver them a USB drive with a CAD file. They never tell you what the actual lead time is. If they do tell you, it ends up being totally off. Instead, it ends up impacting your build schedule. And instead, Hadrian's we're going to, similar to MagDrive, focus on just making this a wonderful, very differentiated experience where you can drag and drop a CAD file onto an online website. You get a guaranteed lead time. You know that it's going to match the exact precision that you need and the tolerances that you need, and it's going to be very well tested, and the alloy is going to be the exact alloy that you need. And then once they do that, then they'll start to expand ever so slightly. They'll add different types of materials. So maybe they'll add titanium as opposed to just aluminum. They'll start to expand into larger products beyond just fasteners. But again, taking that, because this value chain is so established, better to focus on just a very narrow segment on it and absolutely crush it. And so they're specifically focused on just the manufacturing of aluminum parts that go into space. Products like satellites and rockets.
And so is it the reason companies like Hadrian didn't exist before? Is it as simple as to say because until very recently just the production numbers in space were just way too small, and hence it was a cottage industry? That's probably
exactly it, right? The volume was low enough that it just made sense to be done by mom and pop shops, because there wasn't a sort of massive business to be had there. But as the sort of exponential growth of the rocket and the satellite industry has taken off, that cottage industry, one, is now large enough that there are real outcomes that can be built building a business there, but then two, two, also the pain points have gotten so much more painful because these cottage industries don't know how to grow exponentially, right? And so it becomes a sort of area that's ripe for opportunity where both the customer pain point is extremely high, and the value of that is growing exponentially as well.
Yeah, but I mean that's this cottage industry point is not only for the bolts, right? I mean that's actually true for many parts of like satellites. There's just tons and tons. I actually remember like Doug Sinclair mentioning it once to me that he thought like most of it is basically cottage industry. So I guess there's then many more sort of like Hadrian type opportunities, right?
Solar panels, flight computers, eventually full satellite buses. Like one of the things that I always think about is that one of the biggest opportunities I feel like right now in space is the fact that there's an opportunity to build sort of like what I call the like Dell for space.
Totally for satellites, right?
Now, like exactly. Like you can kind of buy a satellite off the shelf today. Not really. It's more that there's just like more providers that will do it out of house for you, but there's not like actually hardware sitting on a shelf anywhere. Versus I think a similar sort of approach to Hadrian could exist for actually just making it so that there are flight computers and batteries and solar panels that are truly sitting off the shelf and are more mass manufactured on an automotive like assembly line or a consumer electronics assembly line, as opposed to right now most rad hardened flight computers are effectively almost like built by hand.
Yeah. But the Dell comparison is really interesting. I thought basically my comparison was sort of like the sort of contract manufacturer for iPhone type thing, right? Just like outsourced, super efficient mass manufacturing type thing, right? And clearly,
but in some ways, you want a brand behind it. Like the first thing that you want is like Dell first, so that it's like the place that you can go to that isn't just the manufacturer, but they're like the brand and like the owner, and they like run the software and they make it so that if something breaks, you can go to them and there's like a warranty and things like that, as opposed to purely like a contract manufacturing like relationship.
Yeah, fair enough. I can see that. There's also a space where people are very concerned about reliability and all of that. That's fair enough. Okay, let's okay, cool. We've actually managed to go through touch on all of your portfolio companies. Only a cash we haven't. Maybe we'll get there still. But I want to take a step back and sort of talk about universe of investment opportunities in space. And so we kind of talked through the thesis for in space manufacturing for Earth. Let's almost do like not like a lightning round, but I'm just going to throw out like a few kind of call it subsectors in space and see like what do you think. I'm just going to ask about launch because I mean there's like we have something like in our database something like 200 launch companies on paper, right? So which maybe like a few dozen are sort of serious in terms of funding, but it's just many, right? You guys are one of the original investors in SpaceX. I mean, what are your thoughts on about launch at this point?
I just think at this point, it is unlikely that there's going to be a new launch company, founded that becomes massive, given just the level of players that are in the space and their level of competence. Because in some ways, it's like the railways, where it's just like yes, like there will probably be 4, 5, maybe 6, maybe even 10 operators. Are there going to be 100 operators? Absolutely not. And at some point, also, I think it's going to go the way of like airlines in the U.S., where at some point also the like manufacturer of the actual rocket is going to become different than the actual operator of the rocket, via regulations and stuff. I think that industry has like a lot of maturing to go through, but I'm not sure I totally understand the venture investors that are, investing in, rocket companies in 2020 or 2021. It feels like you're sort of a decade, sort of too late, to the ecosystem, and that market is already, quite mature. And unlikely to have a lot of alpha in terms of investing.
Yeah, so actually, so one related point to launch, I guess. So I mean, obviously, the key company here is SpaceX, right? And then the key within SpaceX, for a variety of reasons, right now, I believe is basically Starship. So I think it's fair to say that in-house we believe that this is going to work for a variety of reasons. I don't know, did you share that view?
Yeah, I mean, I have a variety of friends that work on Starship, and they're some of the best engineers that I know in the world. Yeah. And I think the question is always with Elon companies and it's like timing, not like if. And so I think he's being a bit aggressive on the timing. But in some ways, the Falcon 9 Block 5 is like such an incredible product at an incredible price point that like even just having other providers reach that is going to be an extremely difficult milestone for many of them. And then by the time they even reach it, he's going to have sort of innovated to the next step of the curve. And so, I think it's more likely that Starship is like, let's say, launches more than once a year to orbit. Probably feels more like 2025 or 2026. I'm a little more skeptical of his he wants to do orbital launches regularly in like 23 or 24. That feels not likely.
I think it was to be on Mars with cargo in 24. No, anyway.
I know.
Anyway, and that kind of brings me to another related point. It's sort of like, let's say it's my second pet peeve. Like my first pet peeve was the one that's like, there's not enough non-space entrepreneurs in the space sector. One of my other pet peeves is, and pet peeve is a strong word, but whatever, is basically, I'm hardly getting any Starship reliant business plans. And sort of like, even if it only works in 24 or 25, right? Like this is like using the famous hockey analogy. This is where the puck is going to be. All of the business plans I'm getting is sort of where the puck is right now. It's like, oh, I'm going to launch on a Falcon 9 or something, right? Or on Rocket Lab Electron. I don't know. What do you think about that? I mean, would you also like to see more? I mean, there's just, if you have a 100-ton or 150-ton up capacity to low Earth orbit, it's just completely game changing, no?
Yeah, I guess I maybe land more on the like other side, which is like I do think it's important to be like, commercially pragmatic and not have too much external risk to the company. And so ideally what I would like to see is like people that can both make money on the Falcon 9, but then also immediately have a plan for when Starship goes online, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the ideal where it's like, I think you actually in some ways want both sides of it of, it's the same thing that we think about in Varda. It's like we have a like configuration, hardware, et cetera, that we're going to make sure to be like launching on a regular basis on the Falcon 9. And it's going to de-risk many parts of our technical stack. And that same technical stack applies extremely well to when Starship is online. But thankfully, that won't be like the first time that we're launching. At that point, we'll have de-risked many parts of our technical stack and are ready to adapt to our Starship capacity. Versus, most people aren't necessarily like thinking about that, planning for it. Their Falcon 9 launches aren't necessarily de-risking the thing that would be the sort of ideal architecture for when you have something that's 100 tons to orbit. So I think the answer is maybe somewhere in between. That like yes, you both need to plan for Starship, but I don't think you should orient your entire business only around Starship.
Unless maybe you have to because you're building. I don't know. You need that much up capacity.
And that's where I'm like not as interested in funding those companies where it's like I don't think that you should be building something that can only work with Starship quite yet. Right. I think Elon is great and exciting, but there are many ways that some of this stuff can go wrong. You get hit by a bus tomorrow and SpaceX can fold, or Tesla goes out of business or something, and that wipes them out. And so they're just there's lots of risks that come with building a business that's too reliant on an external provider. So
by the way, did I read it correctly? You guys at Varda, I think you signed up with the Rocket Lab Electron, the Photon platform.
It was a Photon. So we are purchasing their satellite platform, the Photon, and then we haven't announced our launch provider yet. So the Photon
so it doesn't necessarily have to go on Electron or Neutron or whatever.
Yeah. So we explicitly said, in that original announcement that we'll be planning on, doing a ride share, but we haven't actually announced who that launch will be with yet.
Okay. Coming back to sort of like our briefly discussing like various potential opportunity sectors. Okay, so we talked like launch, including Starship. How about sort of, I don't know, potential next big thing like satellite communications, right? I mean, you have like very traditional satellite communications, GEO, then we had the first wave of sort of like other constellations, like which all went bankrupt, right? Like in the late 90s, like Iridium, Globalstar, and so forth. Now we got like Starlink and Project Kuiper on the broadband side. We have like, I lost count, probably 24 IoT constellations. Then we have the component side. I don't know, is there anything you find interesting sort of in the SATCOM value stack?
I get more excited, in relation to like SATCOM around like just like the next gen, like satellite servicing, satellite, refueling, satellite,
I'm going to get to that. That's orbit services. Okay, we can do that if you want. I mean, if there's nothing in SATCOM, we can talk orbit services.
I guess, I don't get super excited by like SATCOM. I just think like, Starlink's doing an incredible job. There's a handful of companies that I think have the opportunity to, do really well with backhaul, like Astronis and things like that. But, I think it's an interesting market. I just think it's really hard to compete with the economics of like terrestrial fiber, and it's only continuing to improve. And so, SATCOM, in a best case scenario ends up being, 10, 15, 20% of like the, internet market as a whole. But I don't think it ever really gets, much above that. And man, just like, it's just really tough to compete against just like laying a, tube of glass and like, communicating through it. But there's obviously, areas like, rural, et cetera, where, fiber doesn't necessarily make sense. But not an area that I necessarily pay, a ton of attention to. But like the orbital servicing area, that's one area that I'm like, really excited by, where it feels like it's one of those things that there's ways to clearly, de-risk now, through sort of smaller scale launches and technical proof points. And that as Starship starts to come online, then you can really create, sort of game changing, products in terms of, being able to actually, have something that consistently, stays in orbit and refuels lots and lots of different satellites, partially because of the increased capacity for launch, but also because of the increased density of satellites up there. Just like, just like gas stations don't make sense until there's enough cars on the road. Same thing sort of in space, where orbital gas stations don't make sense until there's enough satellites on the road. The economics just don't work out.
I was going to say that because you can kind of play it in the good and bad way, right? So in the good sense, it's a clear sort of picks and shovels play, right? Well, many of these businesses are. And on the bad sense, it's like you're saying, well, it's sort of a derivative business, right? It's sort of like people put satellites up there because hopefully they do something useful for Earth, and then you, as a derivative, have those satellites basically as customers, which I guess means it pushes it a few years out and has this additional layer of risk.
Totally. Yeah. I similarly like segment each business by like, is this one that is trying to provide value for Earth, or is this mostly providing value within the space ecosystem? I think both are obviously valuable and important, right? MagDrive is purely providing value within space. Hadrian is as well, versus Varda is explicitly on the other side of that. So I think both are important to have, but dropping infrastructure costs, logistics costs, servicing costs always improve the economics of the ones that are actually providing value to those other industries on Earth, and so it's important as well.
Yeah. So one open services, one quirky one that we've looked at a few companies, and there's another one coming out of Y Combinator now, Turian, which is basically managing space debris. We passed on everything, and I can explain why. I don't know. Is anything you've looked at? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly to let's say orbital servicing and refueling, space debris becomes sort of more important as there's more satellites up there. I think my major question is going to be around space debris. Sort of strikes me as a similar thing to like airline traffic, and airline traffic. For sure, there's some companies that have made some amount of money selling into air traffic control and things like that, but they're not like massive outcomes. And so I fear that it'll be sort of a industry that largely sells to regulators and becomes sort of a government based program, as opposed to something that has sort of massive commercial upside. And so while I think there is something there, it's not clear to me that it's as big as commercial upside as just focusing entirely on the commercial market.
Okay, so I'm gonna open up a sidetrack here, because you brought up an interesting point. This is a whole government point, right? So obviously, traditionally, space sector very dependent on government, and arguably SpaceX in its early years extremely dependent on the government, to some extent still today, right? And it's true for many space companies, right? I mean, you mentioned Spire having commercial customers, but Spire also has a big government business, right? I mean, I guess it's sort of this ambivalent thing, right? It's sort of like, it's really great the governments are there because they're sort of providing sort of a base level of demand or something, right? And then you have like the non-dilutive funding depending on the countries and stuff like that. And then of course some people don't like it because like, well, this is too dependent on government, and governments can change and policies can change and everything. I don't know, how does that enter into sort of your evaluation of companies?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I think it's been really exciting to see the United States, over the past decade, and especially so in the past 3 years, reorient around trying to be a significant player in the venture capital ecosystem. Whether it's the combination of SBIR programs getting rolled out across a variety of different operating groups, or groups like the Defense Innovation Unit, where they are reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense, and they're the only contract agency that does so. I think all of these, are signals that the, DoD is becoming, sort of better and more friendly to work with as a startup. And I think they're, they're great as an investor, because it sort of allows you to invest further down the technical curve where, okay, maybe there are certain things that just aren't commercially viable yet, but they're viable for the DoD and defense and government. And the DoD is very interested in funding it for the first 3 years. And that it acts as the stepping stone that eventually gets it to commercial viability. And so, yeah, it's definitely something that I actively, underwrite or think about with a lot of companies. What's nice is there used to be a much more reliance on NASA, and that was much more reliant on political whims of the particular administration, versus the DoD is a much larger beast and much slower to move between administrations, and so it's much more consistent. And so, yeah, I guess the net conclusion being that I do underwrite it. I'm not as fearful of the political whims, changing that much. And I think at this point, also, the just commercial economy has just gotten so big that, like, even if all DoD funding were entirely to stop in space, it would slow things down, and quite a bit. But it wouldn't kill things. Even 3 years ago, it would have killed things. Today, it will no longer kill things.
Yeah, no, agreed. Okay, coming back to sort of our investment stuff and finishing up here. Okay, another quirky one for you. Sort of lunar economy. It's kind of moving back on the radar screen, right? Because there's a bunch of upcoming lunar missions. Starship works, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, just like space manufacturing for space. It's like, it's interesting intellectually, and I'm excited that like some people are working on it. But at the end of the day, you're only there's not going to be any real commercial customers there for a very long time. Yeah. You're talking about 5, 7, 10 years away, and so unfortunately just not venture backable, but at least venture backable at the scale of outcomes that we need. I understand that there's sort of seed space investors that can invest in something that only has $150 or $200 million outcome, and being a subcontractor for NASA provides those types of outcomes. That can be fine, but not interesting, unfortunately, to like a founders fund.
Yeah. Is there anything? Okay, so let me ask you the other way around. I mean, is there anything you wish that would be there in space? I mean, you kind of like, when you incubated Varda because you couldn't find any company. Is there any other opportunity you wish there was something there that existed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something around sort of like satellite servicing and satellite refueling that, there's some companies that are working on it, but I think if I were to like incubate a company and do it from scratch, I would take slightly different approaches. But I think there's at least the players in space servicing and space refueling are sort of much better suited and much more in the right direction than any of the space manufacturing players were. So I feel like it's more likely that there will turn out to be an interesting investment that I can make there, as opposed to having to incubate something there.
Okay. As we're kind of winding down towards the end here, let me ask you a few different questions. So if everything goes well, let's pick some sort of sensible time frame. I don't know, but 2030, right? What will space look like, and then where will companies like Varda be ideally?
I think by 2030, you'll have on the order of 50 to 75 humans living in low Earth orbit or beyond. I think you'll have space factories that are re-entering materials on basically daily basis, down here, to Earth. I think you'll have, multiple internet constellations covering the entire Earth, multiple observation constellations covering the entire Earth across a variety of different spectral bands. And you'll have on the order of, 10 plus heavy lift commercial launch providers that are going to space quite regularly, and probably the early days of like a government run sort of research colony, sort of the equivalent size of what the ISS is today, having an equivalent sort of facility basically on the moon, and regular commercial resupply to there. That's probably my intuition. So on the order of like 6 to 7 people consistently living on the moon, and on the order of like 50 or so living in low Earth orbit, and probably in low Earth orbit doing commercial activity, more so than just government research.
Anybody on Mars?
Probably not. Probably not.
We'll see the timelines. Okay, well, let me ask you the other way around, without trying to be gloomy or anything. So, I mean, we're both clearly very excited about sort of potential space economy. What could go wrong? What could derail us, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's starting to just be, sort of more and more stability. I think the thing that could, derail things is if you have too many of these sort of like public companies that are, going out right now, Rocket Lab, Spire, Astra, et cetera.
Oh, you're saying kind of like a bubble burst, people get, investors get frustrated, that kind of thing?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, investors only invest when they think there's going to be like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
And so if the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, looks a little too rusty and not too colorful, then people's enthusiasm upstream really dries up quite quickly. And so I think the like sort of leading indicator to be tracking about whether or not there's a bubble is, whether or not these sort of publicly traded companies do well over the next like 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And it's partially why I get excited by companies like Spire, where Spire's revenue base is so deep in the like non-space world that it feels more likely that even if everything else crashes around it, Spire can continue to perform well and continue to do well. And you only need a handful of companies like that, right? Like where after the .com bubble, there's only a handful that survived, but that was enough to sort of keep the internet and technology ecosystem alive and get to where it is today. And so I think you could see a similar sort of .com bust.
Agreed.
But I think thankfully we're already past the point where it won't fully die. It just might be that there will be a very small handful of survivors.
Yeah, and plus what we said before, one difference to the internet.com bubble is you have the underlying government demand, which will continue and probably grow, to be honest, for geopolitical reasons.
Totally. I mean, as China continues to run their own independent space station, as they start to do, more space projects, the U.S. will want to step up as well.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you think that might derail us?
No, at the end of the day, as long as investor dollars flow, ecosystems thrive, right? And so at the end of the day, that's like the primary thing to be tracking. Because at the end of the day, I feel like, maybe this is obviously me having a bias from speaking from an investor perspective, but everything flows from that. The more investors that there are, the more companies that get funded, the more news that there is about space, the more aerospace engineers go to college and want to work in aerospace, the more talent that there is, et cetera. It all comes down to it all comes down to the money.
I agree. Actually, it's funny for me. Actually, the sort of I wouldn't call it a risk, but sort of like something that we need to fix is something I mentioned before. It's just I wish there was more entrepreneurs and more investors in the sector. I want to drag them in even faster to make this grow faster.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I would actually say I think there's at least maybe it's different in the United States, but man, there's a lot of my more traditional investor friends that all of a sudden I'm seeing them do a lot of space companies.
No, true.
This is amazing to see. So it's definitely growing.
Okay, different question. How do you what are your sort of favorite ways, if any, to keeping tabs on the space sector? I mean, you mentioned you started going to conference and stuff like that, but I don't know if there's anything else. Could be anything. Could be podcasts, could be books, could be conferences. I don't know. People on Twitter.
Yeah, so I really like this one newsletter, Payload Space. They do a really good job of sort of breaking everything down in the space economy, and then I really like just following all the reporters that cover the space industry. So Michael Sheets, Eric Berger, Lauren Gersh, all of them. I think Ashley Vance all provide just a really great sort of up to date heartbeat of what is going on in the space industry. And then some of my favorite conferences are Space Symposium in Colorado and Small Sat in Logan, Utah. I think going to both of those gives you a really broad, view into the entire sort of space industry.
Yeah, agreed. Did you go to Satellite this week?
I didn't, unfortunately, in DC, but was wanting to.
Okay, cool. And then I'm speaking of resources. I totally forgot. I think you have your own podcast as well, Operators Podcast.
Yeah, it's obviously very unrelated to space, but mostly just interview basically people that have been early employees and executives at very high growth companies. So everything from DoorDash, Ramp, Fair, tons of different companies that I've interviewed. And the idea being that on podcasts, too many people interview just boring VCs like us and CEOs, and they should instead be interviewing the much more interesting people that are actually operating the companies.
Yeah, and like I say, even though it's technically not related to space, I think it's still a very valuable resource for people who want to be space entrepreneurs. So I still just a shout out and I recommend it. Last thing I want to talk about, because I love it and I know you love it too, I think by now, is the city of Miami. Founders Fund opened up an office. Many other startups are popping up in Miami. How's the ecosystem now? And is there any sort of link to space? I guess the space activity in Florida is obviously more in Central Florida, Space Coast, and then thereabouts. But I don't know. Is there any sort of connection, or maybe now, maybe in the future, with the Miami ecosystem?
I do actually think so. I mean, I think the reason that sort of most of the space companies in Florida are on the Central Coast is just because that's where Vandenberg was, and there didn't really make sense to be anywhere else in Florida. Versus now that Miami has all of a sudden become a massive investor ecosystem, basically overnight, where you sort of have on the order of at this point it's $350 billion of AUM, right? That's basically as large as the entire space economy combined has moved to Miami over the course of the last year. I am starting to see both space entrepreneurs and companies that already exist opening offices down here, being founded down here as they want to be sort of near this ecosystem. So that's partially why I sort of split my time basically between Miami and LA, sort of the two major space hubs. In the US, at least for me, and I'm hoping that Miami becomes more and more of one over the coming 5 to 10 years.
No, I agree, and I guess maybe it's feasible. Even if you have something hardware, maybe you could have your sort of office in Miami, and then you have your facility up in Cape Canaveral, where Space Florida is offering good incentives and all of that.
Exactly, and it's a short hop up, and we actually have a really great private trail train line that runs between the two.
Yeah. By the way, I mean, one related question I'm curious about: why do you think sort of 2 minutes why Miami suddenly? Because I used to have an apartment in Miami about 7-10 years ago. I used to go there all the time, and I was always thinking, why can't this be a bigger sort of entrepreneurial hub? And the only entrepreneurial company was basically stuff that was Latin America oriented and some random others. Why did you think this happened? Is it as simple as a lot of people give credit to Francis Suarez, who I think is a great mayor, but is there anything else?
I mean, I really think it comes down to just a handful of individuals and a black swan of I literally joked that the first domino that fell was Jack Abraham from Atomic Ventures moving to Miami, and whatever it was, April of 2020. That is eventually what led to Founders Fund considering an office there, Founders Fund opening an office there. That's what led to us announcing it. That's what got on the mayor's attention. That's what eventually led to my tweet talking about moving Silicon Valley to Miami. That eventually led to the first viral tweet of the mayor talking about moving Silicon Valley to Miami, and eventually got him on CNN, Washington Post, both of us getting interviewed across all these things. I think it's just there's not some big macro thing. It's actually just the decisions of less than 10 people all of a sudden literally changed an entire or sort of created an entire ecosystem from scratch.
Interesting dynamics.
Super exciting. And at this point, it's obviously much larger than any of the 10 of us. It's incredible to see how quickly the ecosystem is riding the exponential curve.
And it really is. And I recommend it to founders who are location flexible. I recommend everybody visit there. Last question, as always, is about science fiction. Do you like science fiction? And if yes, what are some of your favorites?
I mean, I like, Delta V, which is about asteroid mining, 70s by Neil Stephenson, which is about the moon breaking apart. Obviously classic, Martian by Andy Weir. Andy Weir's latest book, which is the name is slipping me right now, I like as well. Huge sci-fi fan. Those are some of my favorites that I just listed.
Good stuff. But I mean, I guess your day job and my day job is we got to turn science fiction into reality. So let's do that over the next few years.
Exactly.
It was a pleasure to have you. All the best to Founders Fund, to all of your portfolio companies, and maybe we'll do this again in in a couple of years or so and see how far things got.
Sounds great. Thanks, Raphael. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.